here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of Frank Deserto, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Also, he's compiled a compilation album that's come out on Cherry Red Records, which is titled No Songs Tomorrow, Darkwave, Ethereal Rock and Coldwave, 1981 to 1990. It's a 4-CD box set that features an amazing array of bands, including The Cure, the COCTEAU, Twins, Dead Can Dance, and basically millions of bands. So you're going to find out more about that. He's also not only compiled it, but put the sleeve notes together. And as you know, with Cherry Red Records, it's been beautifully designed. And also Frank has worked on various other compilations that's come out on Cherry Red Records, which includes Cherry Stars Collide and also Silhouettes and Statues. I do believe I might be wrong, but anyway, look, you're going to find out more in this interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was Frank's early formative years. Frank, it's over to you.
Goodness. So I was born in 82, so I missed the 80s when they came out, but I was an early 90s kid, and one of my first loves was my dad taking me to like these old car shows that played a lot of girl pop, doo-wop, early rock and roll. That led way into David Bowie and classic rock. David Bowie was massive, and then the alternative explosion of like Smashing Pumpkins, Nine Inch Nails, The Cure came from that, and then looking backwards is kind of how I looked at things from there. Everybody that these bands looked up to, and that's the 80s, the low of the 80s.
Because it's quite an interesting thing, because when I sort of started my little musical journey, which was a little bit in the late 60s, but then it was the 70s, I realised I didn't have that far to go back to the beginning of, the start of pop, but then before then there was like Elvis and Little Richard and people like that, and then there's blues and jazz. But generally, 63, you've sort of just got to go back about 10 years and you're there. But actually, sort of getting into the late 90s, you've got a lot of decades to go back through and a lot of different things to discover. So, so what's it like for such a young person yourself? Sort of, how do you follow that narrative? Because mine, there are like other little, as you know, from each decade, you have to start digging down a bit more and finding little themes. But so what's it like when you sort of discover music in the late 90s?
Well, so getting into music in the early 90s and then finding out what was coming out in the late 90s, there was a lot of new metal and boy bands and stuff I didn't care for. So that's where I went. Was like, okay, well, getting into these bands in the early to mid 90s, what were they listening to? Who were their idols? What were their favorites? And then being able to mine backwards. So I mined backwards a bit more into shoegaze, and then mined really into new wave, especially through like, I guess Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor would be like talking about all Gary Newman and the Human League and all these bands and Soft Cell, and that's who they would cover. They would also cover those artists. So those were their idols, and I looked back to that. So instead of moving forward, there wasn't really much there in new music for me.
So you weren't at Woodstock '99 then?
I was not. No, I was already out of that. I was very not into that music. It was not my thing.
So were you a sort of I don't know. Did your sort of group that you were vaguely hanging out with, were they sort of a group that you weren't able to relate to because it was kind of Woodstock '99, Limp Bizkit, the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Horrible. I had when I was like in high school, which was in 96, 97, 98, a lot of my friends were the goth kids, the outcasts, the ones who got me into Cranes or got me into The Cure, bands like that, who really opened my horizons to that. So they all graduated. So by the time that the new metal thing was happening, I didn't really have a lot of musical peers. It was college that really opened that too. So also going to college and really becoming a radio DJ. I was a radio DJ. It was the first thing I wanted to do there. And finding out all these CDs were available to me, I was able to take them out from the library, make copies of them, kept some of them, that kind of thing. They were all these, and that's where I picked up my love of 4AD and went from there, really. So and then in college, everybody kind of had more open-minded taste, I'd like to think. So I found my kin more so in
Yes,
those
my
years.
God.
Yeah.
And did you continue going back through the 70s and into the kind of the 60s as well? Was that sort of a
Yes, and that was, that This Mortal Coil helped with that. There was, because This Mortal Coil covered what Gene Clark and Tim Buckley, and opened my horizons to some of those singer-songwriters. I got into Scott Walker by way of David Bowie, so that kind of helped me out with the 60s. I already had a love of the Ronettes and had a love of like the Beach Boys and things like that. So there was always that framework there. I just didn't know a lot of it. I just knew it was on classic rock radio. So
yes.
things like the 4AD catalog and the singer-songwriter stuff helped me look backwards to it.
Yes. And what was your Bowie, entry and
So Bowie was interesting to me. I started with Bowie, through the usual method. My dad had Ziggy Stardust. My mom would play Let's Dance. But then as the 90s came, Bowie wasn't necessarily cool, but he was trying to like appear to the younger audience. It was like 94, 95, the Outside era. That was
yes.
my new record. I loved Outside from the get-go. So I really, really loved that era of Bowie. I loved Earthling. I liked Hours okay. So I kind of was a fan then, and it was not cool to like David Bowie in the 90s. I'll tell you that. Like in high school, I definitely ate a lot of garbage for, got a lot of, got teased a lot for liking him. He wasn't as cool as he is now, or as he was in the last years of his life. Certainly it's nice to see that everybody's kind of come around.
Yes, well, it was interesting because I was obsessed with Bowie and sort of had this, he's got this thing in my life, that's been with me, and I've got this fantastic collection of books. I've done as many interviews with people who'd worked with him as I possibly could,
Wow.
over the last 5 years, and sort of it's been fascinating to hear how they got to meet him, how they got to work with him, their relationship, and all those things. And I must admit, when he, it's nothing like death, is there? Because I used to love John Peel, and it's like
Sure.
and that was not a good thing because no one particularly liked John Peel when he was alive. But my God, when he died, it was like suddenly everyone was like, "Oh yeah, I love John Peel." I was like, "Oh really?" I was Norman No Mates, and the same with Bowie. It's like, "Oh, that was brilliant." It's like, well, yeah, where were you when he was alive? And
Yeah.
some of those albums weren't easy, and some of them, to be honest, weren't that great. But I also enjoyed knowing the process and just thinking about how he made it and the artistic kind of development. And some of it worked, some of it didn't. But I like the fact that he did seem to say, right, that's that done, next project and stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah, and I loved, my favorite Bowie eras are the Berlin era, the Low, the Heroes, Lodger, the Idiot, all the stuff he was making around that time. Scary Monsters on the peripheral, Station to Station on the periphery. That's the era of his work that I like the best. But also, Outside I feel works with that. So Outside I thought was always I liked it from the get go. I know a lot of people have a hard time with that record. It's long, it's dense, it aligns with like the Young Gods or Nine Inch Nails or something. But that was my music at the time, so it clicked with that for me. It didn't feel it was weirder than Nine Inch Nails, and it definitely had a lot to do with Scott Walker and Tilt and things like that. And it helped me it realize that like I'm more of an art kid, like I'm much more of an art kid in the way I consume music. I still love his glam records. I love Diamond Dogs so much, and I love Aladdin Sane and Ziggy, but that's the area of his work that appeals the most to me, is the artier, more out there records he tends to make,
Yes, well, there's always still things to discover, which I find kind of fascinating, and I've also found, I don't know, I was reading a book recently on Bowie. I can't remember which one it was, but anyway, it was talking about some of these kind of very obscure songs that he wrote about his car, something which was just a really ridiculous song. And I love that kind of the fact that his 60s work was so unbelievably odd. And sort of I'm wondering, because you're thinking he's making this music at the same time you had Hendrix, the Doors, Jefferson Airplane, the Beatles, the Stones, et cetera, et cetera. And he comes along,
yeah.
and he comes along, he brings this record out, and it's like, wow, that's not really on the zeitgeist there, is it?
It's kind of a little goofy. The Anthony Newley thing, right? That's what it was when like he was and like I think Scott Walker changed him, right? It was another one of those things that you heard like, wow, what's this? And then decided, as he usually does, to kind of jump to the thing. And he's never the one that creates it. Everyone credits him with creating it. He never does. He just sees what's next and decides to jump to it. I think heavy metal's the next big thing. Then Men Who Sold the World kind of has that sound. the Berlin records were Kraftwerk, but Kraftwerk was already out. Kraftwerk and Noe were already bands. So it's just always kind of him like grabbing the next thing that he's just on, and then popularizing it, which I think is and he's always credited. He's never said, I made this. And I love that about him. And that's a thing that like every artist in the 90s that I liked, whether it be David Bowie, Trent Reznor, Billy Corgan, they all talked about who they loved. Nowadays, it's like you have a lot of bands who like won't admit they like a certain band, or it's like they're just too embarrassed, or it's not good press, or whatever it may be. So when I come from the era where it's like, if you are influenced by something and you take from it, admit it. Why? I mean, we all know it anyway. Why don't you just admit it and give that band credit? It's really important, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's yes, this is something that people like me, a complete nerd, enjoy doing, because it's the way to discover something else and then going back to the source of something, which is, and then even then, there's another sort of step back in time where those kind of ideas and inspiration came from. So you keep sort of going back. And I always love the fact that Bowie, alongside Lemmy from Motorhead, who were born in the same year, or would always say, it was Little Richard was their kind of go-to. And
right.
then from then it was, but then Bowie had all this kind of jazz kind of interest and fascination, which was again kind of interesting because he really kind of studied it so much. But then he had this strange folk and acoustic music and then mime, and was producing the most kind of awful, some of the most awful songs of this sort of mediocre songs. And then it's this thing with, Angie Bowie, Tony DeFries, then Rono, and then somehow it's like, oh God, that's taken 6 or 7 years, but wow, it's been quite a journey. But now you've got there.
Yeah, and I love it that no one really talks about his work with jazz, by the way. Everyone's like, oh, Black Star is the only jazz record he ever did. I'm like, whoa. There's so much jazz on Aladdin Sane. There's so much jazz permeating. Even some of the 80s work has some jazz in it, some more light jazz, but it's there. Buddha Suburbia, Black Tie White Noise has a lot of jazz in it, a lot of horns, avant-garde jazz. Mike Garson's been with him for how many years and played on almost every record. That's the avant-garde piano work. So there's always been jazz, and I feel like it's another thing after he died, everyone's like, oh yeah, Bowie liked jazz. It's like it's always been there. He's always that love of jazz has always been something he's been.
Yes, well,
about.
Kind of a couple of months ago, I did an interview with a guy who put together the book Bowie at the BBC, all these interviews.
Okay,
and it's kind of fascinating because we all sort of remember Bowie being there in our lives, and then he has his heart attack, and then he disappears.
Yes,
then brings out these 2 albums, and then it's like over. But then he does another interesting interview that no one had ever heard of, particularly known about, that he had after his heart attack with Courtney Pine. And it's in the book, it's transcribed, but you can also find it, the actual interview on YouTube probably, where, he's obviously just appeared, and everyone's like, well, this guy who put the book together, and then myself, we're like, wait a minute, he appeared. I thought he completely disappeared. No one had remembered or found this interview on the BBC with Courtney Pine, where basically it's a bit like, we're just going to talk about jazz and our love for jazz, and it's like, oh my God. And I call myself a Bowie fan. I didn't even know. And he was the same. It's like, no, we all completely missed this one little interview that slipped into this period where we thought he'd totally disappeared. And there he was chatting about him. So do go and check out David Bowie, Courtney Pine, 2004, 5. And you'll be like mesmerized and going, okay, that's interesting. Anyway.
I will. Thank you. Yeah. Cool.
So many things to discover that we sort of forgot. But then coming back to the current period, dear old Cherry Red Records, who's been very keen on these brilliant compilations. And as I mentioned, I did an interview with a guy who compiled this one, The Blank Generation, punk from about 1975 to probably 85. 5 CD box set, but then this one, curious little egg, No Songs Tomorrow, Darkwave, Ethereal Rock, and Coldwave, 81 to 90. So how did you manage to get go with this collection?
So this is a long story, and I'm going to precipice. I'm going to give myself a little backstory with this as well. So I've been very passionate about this kind of music for about as long as we've talked about here. Once I discovered Darkwave, once I discovered this Coldwave music, which is a French subsect of post-punk, I started a music blog in 2007, I believe it was. It's almost been, God, it's been that long. Which I digitized my collection. I put it up there. It's called Systems of Romance, named after the John Fox record, or rather the Ultravox record. Is that crossover there? And it's just me discovering these records in bins and digitizing them and giving them new life. And that's been a big passion of mine for quite a long time. So between that and my love of DJing, there was this party called the Weird Party, WIERD. It was a party in New York that lasted. I did not start it. I just got involved in it in the later years. I was a resident DJ for there, and it was also celebrating this music: Darkwave, Coldwave, post-punk. The more the obscure, the better, but also celebrated some hits too. It was never that precious. But so those two things were my bedrock for really discovering this music. But then getting linked up with Cherry Red came from my writing with postpunk.com. That's a website that I've been working with out of LA based right now that has been going on for quite some time as well. I've been running from the get-go. And this is a funny story. I did a reaction to a Pitchfork article. There was a reaction against their Dream Pop list. Their Dream Pop list was so off the mark. It was 20 records, 5 of them were Beach House. Not one of them mentioned the band A.R. Kane, who I thought was like kind of whitewashing the story, and also it was just an irresponsible article. And so I wrote this whole listed 100 records of Dream Pop that I thought were, and one artist per band that was, and worked on this with my bandmate Greg Fasolino and Amber Crane out of Texas. And we did this, and then Cherry Red contacted me. We're like, you were the one who did that article? And yes, I was. And they wanted to collaborate with me on another box set, which is what came out last year, called Cherry Stars Collide, which is also, it's all dream pop, it's all shoegaze. It's more on the dreamier spectrum of side of things. So we worked on that box set first. And so that came out, and it came out really great, I thought. And this was the second one we've worked on together, No Songs Tomorrow, where they decided, like, hey, this worked out. Let's do another one. What do you think about Darkwave? And I'm like, well, gee, I know quite a lot about this music, as well as I knew about Dream Pop. So that's it. That's really how we got started on this box. Worked on it together with Richard Anderson, who works for the label. And I helped curate. I want to say this was a good chunk of my curation on this one. I really picked a lot of these tracks, and Richard did the work, and then the label got a hold of everybody, and here we are.
My God, that's amazing, because I can remember them bringing out the compilation. The was it Cherry
Stars Collide?
Cherry Stars Collide. That's yes, I got that one as well. Which
that's me. Yep,
that's you as well. God, I should have linked all this up, shouldn't I?
That's okay.
Blimey.
Yeah, this one's slightly different, but then, well, I mean, I'll let you, if you had a question there, go ahead.
Yes. So with that one, again, was that more of a collaboration that you did together?
Both of them were. Both of them, I want to say, I think Cherry Stars Collide was about 50% I brought to the table. I was like, these tracks, we got to have them, and 50% they already were working on before they brought me in. This one was, they did quite a lot too. But I think this was more like I had more free reign to kind of bring in the sound and hone in what I thought Darkwave meant to me. We can get into this in a moment, but Darkwave is such a catch-all genre in so many ways that it means a few different things depending on which country and which region you're looking at. So being able to really pull in a lot of different sounds for this one was kind of great.
Yes. So just explain what Coldwave is, because that's one term that I haven't come across that much.
Yeah, so there's two parts of Coldwave too, because again, it depends on your region. What I think is Coldwave is a very small section of French bands, and these French bands were mostly on Lively Art, the label, or who was a New Rose offshoot, and things like that. So they were bands that sounded like The Cure, and they were in the late '80s, and they were very influenced by that sound, but they also wore paisley shirts and a lot of psychedelia. Pretty much every one of those bands on Lively Art covered a Pink Floyd song, but from the Syd Barrett era. So, and then some of them had electronic. Some of them got into electronic music, and it was '89, so it was like Manchester and techno, and those things were coming in. So they had like more undercurrent of that. So that's what I think. That's what I define as Coldwave, and it's specifically the French or Belgian bands that do this music. But Coldwave in America means kind of EBM industrial. And both are correct. It's just that both were, not like the French bands were really talking to the American bands, especially back in the '80s. They all, the communication breakdown and the way things the press was. Certainly, you can have two genres that mean the same name. I mean, two totally different things.
Yes, my God,
Yeah.
that's amazing. So going back to your that was a 4 CD box set, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The sort of Cherry Stars Collide, which is
Yes, it
Dream
was.
Pop Shoegaze. Was that a little bit easier to put that compilation together?
I'd say both were pretty easy. The real challenge always is like I come at both of them with like way too many tracks. We could have easily done 2 more discs on each box set, both Cherry Stars Collide and No Songs Tomorrow. But then it's all about the licensing. Some bands say no. We don't know. I don't know why. I'm not really privy to that part of the conversation. Why a band says no, or why or maybe a label says no. Some bands don't even know that they're included until after I speak with them. Like, oh, we're on that. Like, anyway. So both were easy to come up. I had these lists for both of them. So many bands we couldn't include on both compilations, and then we have to call that down to what we think is the essentials. And then from there, it's a matter of whether or not the label allows it, or the band says yes, or any of. Sometimes we don't even hear back from anybody. So that's really the challenging part, is making sure that we get a representative crop of artists. There's some songs on both box sets I'm like, oh, we didn't get that. That's really too bad, because there's certain bands I find definitive of the sound that we couldn't get. It's kind of a bummer.
Was there anybody in particular on the Cherry Stars Collide that you thought that was a real shame? But what the hell?
They're not actually of all the shoegaze and dream pop bands, they're not my favorite. But My Bloody Valentine weirdly said no. I don't know why it didn't work out. That was a mystery. There were a couple. Yeah, I think actually for the most part, I got the big ones that I was really interested in for Cherry Stars Collide. There were a couple that said no, and then I fought for really hard. This band Bel Canto, who are Norwegian, who are actually on both box sets. I fought for it. I was like, well, dream pop to me is Bel Canto. There's no other band that encapsulates what I think dream pop is. It's the perfect marriage of what I find that sound to be. And Cherry Red was like, we can't get a hold of them. They're saying no. The label, it's too much of a hassle with the label. And I was like, we got it though. We got it. Can we please keep trying? Can we please keep trying? So I guess maybe I was a squeaky wheel about it, and we did get them. And now that the floodgates have opened with Bel Canto, and we got them again on No Songs Tomorrow. So,
yes.
Yeah, so the biggest one I want to say, if you want, about the Darkwave box set that I really wanted to get, there are 2 bands, Moave from Canada and Handful of Snowdrops, who are actually also Canadian, I believe. Both of them are the 2 biggest, I think, Darkwave bands that I would have thought would have been a quintessential sound for the box set, but we didn't get. So I name checked them in the liner notes, and feel like that's just going to have to do,
Yes, absolutely. And sort of what I find quite curious and interesting with the 80s, because that was kind of my decade, is realizing just how much music was being made at that time, and often wondering why, especially, with Britain, because it's a small country, but it does produce a lot of pop. And at that point, we had, 79, Thatcher gets in, then there's this kind of the Falkland crisis, then the miners' strike, there's Greenham Common. There's a huge amount of unemployment. And in this country, we had, very good social security. So people could, sign on the dole for unemployment benefit. There was also job seekers allowance, enterprise allowance schemes where people could sort of go on one of these schemes and basically have 1 year. As long as they made something up, they could become a painter, gardener, musician, poet. It didn't matter. The Thatcher government said, that's great, we can take you off the figures for unemployment, but actually you're still going to get your, £38 a week, your housing benefit, and a council tax paid. So indirectly, you will be you are sort of unemployed, but you won't be on the statistics. And in that time, I think so many people just thought, oh, actually, I'll just be in a band. I'm at that age. It's absolutely fine. And we also had John Peel, which was this great beacon who would just play these kind of like, oh, I've got a flexi disc, I've got a single, I'll just give it a play, get a John Peel session with Dale Griffin from, Mott the Hoople, suddenly 4 tracks. And then, in this country, we've got, again, it's a tiny place, but every city and town would have an alternative indie night. And then, basically they could just get in their transit van and go around. So I do think it lent itself to this very creative time of bands that theoretically, probably wouldn't bother now. But then, it's like, well, we can get in the Melody Maker, the NME, Sounds, Record Mirror. We did have those kind of gatekeepers, which I think helped, create sort of things that in a way probably shouldn't have worked. Because at the same time, we had Live Aid, we had Spandau Ballet, we had Duran Duran, we had that Trevor Horn production, the Blitz Kids, and suddenly you got all this kind of like, who are these weirdos? I mean, ultra weirdos, aren't they?
Well, yeah, I think Darkwave, like I said, is kind of maybe I wrote this in the liner notes, and I think Cherry Red picked up on this for the press. It is the sexier, darker, weirder version of commercial new wave. Commercial new wave is great. I love a lot of these bands. I love Visage. I love Gary Newman. I love that. But this is just darker and weirder and grittier. It's more about it's there's more. I think there's more substance there in some ways. And yeah, I think a lot of people like you said. I mean, that's certainly something you couldn't do now. You could not in these days be a band. I've tried. I still am in one, but I have to have a job. I'm holding a job down while doing it. I don't have that freedom to just go do what I want and kind of. And the thing is that that's why there's so many of these bands, so many. And I feel like with my work with Systems of Romance, I've been doing it for so long, and I'm still finding music. It's like I can't believe the cornucopia of music that there is from 1977 through, I don't know, even still, but like tapered off maybe in the 90s. And I like a lot of 90s music, as I've mentioned, but the genre sort of got more slim pickings or became kind of a character of itself. A lot of bands sounded too much like Sisters of Mercy, and a lot of the originality went away. But yeah, that's such a fertile period. And then you have like bands from Japan, you have bands from the Netherlands, from Norway, from just everyone. There's just so many of them, and I can't keep, and it's incredible. And then you throw in like genres like minimal synth it all kind of cross pollinates. It's like a band could be a darkwave band, but also still has like goth sounds or a lot of it gets messy with genres, I'll tell you.
Yes.
And it's yeah.
But one thing that sort of comes out is that with these compilations, they're mostly kind of either European, British bands, aren't they? There's not a lot from America and Canada. Well, there were a few, but
Canada had a lot. Canada had what, Network Records, so there was obviously there's some Skinny Puppies. Not that we had Skinny Puppy on there, but you had that kind of EBM sound coming from Canada. America's interesting because it's such a big country that you did have bands. You had the Abecedarians out west. You had Four Against from Nebraska. But the thing is, I'm only naming a couple. You had Black Tape for a Blue Girl, who are on the Darkwave collection, and you had Project Records on the whole. There are definitely pockets of it, but with such an expansive place and taste being a little more mainstream, you also have America has a lot of rock and roll, a lot of blues music, a lot of things like that. And there's such a different, goth bands probably couldn't really take wind in like the Midwest so much as they might be able to, or the Southwest even as much as they could in like the cities like New York, obviously, or some spots in California. You had a lot of desert goth bands out there like SciComm or Community FK. There are certain pockets, like Independent Project Records had something, but really it's not as unified as say England, which had you just turn the corner and there's another band doing that. Yeah.
Yes. Probably lacking a lot of sunlight and vitamin D as well, weren't they, at that time in their life? I mean, putting together this kind of compilation, did you have much angst over the running order of it? Because you start with The Cure, don't you, and the funeral party. Did you feel, was this kind of a tricky situation of how you were going to sort of segue all this together and make it sort of flow beautifully?
So I'm not going to take credit for that. My one rule was starting with the funeral party for this one, because I feel like Darkwave is the genesis of bands taking from The Cure and taking from Susie and the Banshees and from Depeche Mode. We couldn't get Susie and the Banshees or Depeche Mode, so we got The Cure, and I felt like that was the way to kick it off. For this one, I think Richard and Cherry Red handled most of the sequencing, but then I helped, guide a little bit of that process, gave it a listen, made sure it flowed. As a mix maker at heart, we made a couple tweaks to it, and things like that. But for the most part, the sequencing for this one was really easy. For Cherry Stars Collide, I'll note, that one we decided, with the exception of going with A.R. Kane first, for the same reasons I mentioned before about not wanting to whitewash over them, we put them first, and then everything else was chronological. So that was an easy rule for that one. But we did something different for this one. We decided to go for more flow. So certain discs on No Songs Tomorrow are more the dancier. I think disc 3 is the one that has more dancier artists on it. And there's certain ones that are more ethereal because, again, Darkwave means so much to different people. And has different pockets. So we try to group. I think Cherry Red's idea, and seconded by me, was to pocket some of those sounds closer together to flow better.
Yes. Were you kind of aware of the kind of all the interesting sort of geography of sort of some of these places, like where you had Leeds had a particular scene, you had Sheffield had a particular scene. I mean, were you thinking, God, I could just put all those bands from that that region and just stick it on? Were you occasionally think, I can't just do that because it's just going to be a goth compilation?
Right. No, I didn't bring that to mind, but it was definitely in my head somewhere. And because I do have a very big knowledge of geography through my collecting years, and I like doing that in my DJ set. Sometimes I'll play like 5 bands from the Netherlands in one set, so geography is important to me, and it's always interesting to hear what bands kind of pick up on the same thing, the French Belgian thing that I talked about before as well. But yeah, we kind of spread it out, and I think that was by design. It was more about how things sounded together than region, and that was intentional, I would say.
Yes, and you got one of my favorites, which I was not surprised, but I was thinking, oh God, yes, Heavenly Bodies Rains on Me.
Oh yes, I love that record. I've been playing, so that's one that I digitized, the 12-inch version for my blog. I've been DJing that track since the mid 2000s, like 2007, 8, 9. I've loved it for a long time. I love the COCTEAU twins and anything that sounds like them. And that's obviously, in the world of that, they have that connection to what SPK and Dead Can Dance and members of those bands. Oh, that reminds me, SPK is another band I really wanted to have for this collection.
Yes.
There's so many eras of not the early industrial, but the era where they're on Network, where they're doing Breathless, or the Byzantine Flowers record that's really almost neoclassical. Those are the kind of records, those are the ones that I really wanted to track from that era, and we couldn't get it. But anyway, Heavenly Bodies, back to that. I think that whole record is great, and it's really undersung. I tried to get them for the Ethereal compilation, because they walk that line between electronic and also dream pop. But I'm glad we got them for this one. I'm glad you noticed. That's one of my favorite.
Yes, that was. And were people like Liebach, were they on your radar, or did you think that doesn't quite fit with this feel?
Yeah. I thought Liebach. They didn't even cross my mind for this, because I thought they were staunchly more on the EBM side of things. We have some EBM crossover in Darkwave. There are bands, like I said, SPK has a little bit of that. Who do we have on here? Like bands like Museum of Devotion, who have definitely that darker, harder, pummeling sound. We didn't put anything like Split Second or Front 242, but that sort of cold electronic vibe is part of Darkwave to me. And as far as the European bands, there are the German subsect of bands that do have a bit of crossover. I'd have to see. I know we have some EBM adjacent things on here, but Liebach would just felt like too far out there on that spectrum,
Yes, because I just wondered, because I remember seeing, I think it was the Young Gods many decades ago, and thinking, they did an amazing song called September, and I just wondered if that was one of those ones that you could have been either way, or did you feel like they were definitely not part of this kind of ethos?
The Young Gods, I think the Young Gods were the late 80s, early 90s, so I guess they maybe could have just squeezed by. But I thought, this going too hard and too electronic and too aggro was not the move. That was kind of my thought going to it. So we did cut a lot of things that kind of felt too EBM-y. But now I'm re-looking at it. But we do have bands like Psyche, or who do we have? Like Metageisen, who are more electronic. There are, so Neon were a bit harder on the EBM side. So we do try to get a bit of that in there, but it just felt like they had to have a little more dream vibes or female vocals or something that made it a little sexier, like I said.
Yes. Because what I've noticed, and I think, the timing of this is quite brilliant and just good, actually. People have become so interested in this period, haven't they? Probably 10 years ago, you'd have had Tumbleweed when this came out, but now there is such an interesting kind of fascination with this decade, and people are there's so many books, there's so many films, there's kind of exhibitions happening, and people are mining this. And you mentioned 4AD at the beginning, but I last year saw a film on the first ever release on 4AD about the band called Rima Rima.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, oh my God, they lasted 8 months, they brought out one 12-inch single, and someone's managed to make a film about them. And again, I did an interview with 2 members of Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry recently, because they've got a new album that is going to be coming.
Yeah, I've heard about that, yeah.
very
excited about that.
soon. And then, yeah, there's just a lot of these bands are still making music. Dance Society are happening, and there's a lot of those goth bands that aren't on this compilation who have reformed and have recently been,
Yes.
are doing a circuit, thinking actually people are quite interested. Actually, we'll put out an album. It's just kind of interesting that everybody that I've been speaking to have sort of done their 5 years of music, the ups and downs and the emotional torture, and has slightly crept back into it again, thinking,
Right.
yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And A, we've got to sort out our archive. B, I've let some of the emotional problems heal over a little bit. Actually, we could sort of, with a few other people, make another record again if we dare. So it's kind of interesting how many bands have become much more popular now than they were. Like the guy I spoke to last night about the Avengers have suddenly, are touring the Dam with the Dam next month, June 2024.
That's
aren't
right.
they?
That's right.
So,
Yeah, they are.
yes, your timing is brilliant.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned it's more recent, because when I was DJing this weird records party and making my blog, that's the kind of thing I think helped bring this music back. There was the post-punk revival in 2002, 2000, like bands like Interpol and like trying to name check the Chameleons, like that kind of thing. So that this music kind of started coming back in a guitar way, and then these parties, these DJ nights, we all mined the past, we all put it out there. These blogs helped bring this back, and then it's funny that because I think a lot of times, I think by the time that these parties ended, were like 2013, 14, we felt this had peaked and everybody's going back into techno. But then, here we are. A lot of these bands are reuniting, like you said. It's between shoegaze bands and 80s bands. It's all these bands that they're so volatile back then for them. Probably there's a lot of emotion, a lot of pressure on them to make them successful, maybe some substance problems, some things like that. Like it was really a lot going on in their lives. And then now they're, 20 years later, 30 years later, we're all all the younger generations coming back around again. They're like, well, we could do this again. Yeah, we could do it. And, speaking about shoegaze, like Slowdive is a great example of a band that was panned when they were out.
Yes.
Everybody hated them. And then they're doing the best work of their careers now. And everybody is like, thank God you're back, and it's great to see that. And so there's other bands, I want to say, like bands on the compilation, like 11 Pond reunited, based upon some of this DJ work and blog work. Lycia is still together. Lycia still plays, still makes records. They're an American band actually too, and they're still together. Black Tape for Blue Girl still making music with different lineups. There's a lot of these bands that are still together. Clan of XYMOX still plays. They've changed their lineup, I want to say 3 or 4 times over the years. And then I think bands like Invisible Limits have reunited. Collection Darnell Andrea, a French Coldwave band, play still. So there's a lot of them still find homes in Europe, I would say. A lot of the bands who are still together or still play. I have traveled a few times to see bands, and I'll continue to do so. Because,
yes, absolutely.
It's hard to get them here,
I know. I think there's one, No More, which I did an interview with them last year. And I think they're still performing, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And XML Deutschland, I think they've also got some new publicity and some information.
Yes.
And also Sad Lovers and Giants, who are just unbelievable.
Oh, so good.
Again, but they find themselves bigger in Europe than they do in the UK, which is interesting. And there's another band which I put into that kind of category, which also The Trees, which is another one of those ones which has just been, again, fascinating story. And actually, when he moved into Europe, I can't remember if it was Switzerland, he was in a record shop and bumped into a member of the Young Gods and did a collaboration, and is still working together. So there are these things are still kind of happening, and I feel that they're still kind of excited. But it is interesting that with a lot of those people, and I think it was your previous compilation had Kellyanne Orphan on, they found that they were much more popular in Italy, and some bands are popular in Spain, some are in France, but there's little pockets. And they're the places that have kept them going. And I know the member who's still alive, from Kellyanne Orphan, had some Italian producer who said, look, I'll fund a new record if you want to do a release. And so it's just interesting that all these people are sort of curiously sort of coming out of the woodwork again, and are sort of looking forward as well as putting their archive together.
So that's funny. You should mention both XML Deutschland and also the trees. I just spoken to both of them. I've just done interviews with them, both Anya and Simon. Anya, yeah, she's made a new record on her solo record, and she was in America recently, and we were talking about this whole thing, and it's great that she's recapturing that, because XML Deutschland, she was telling me that Germany did not really care about them, but England did, and America does. We still hear XML Deutschland tracks at Goth Nights here in the States, even in New York. So they're really tremendous, and I'm glad that they're reissuing some of those hard to get early records. And also the Trees are amazing, because they're a band, I want to say firstly that when this compilation started, we were doing it as Darkwave, and then when we started realizing there was more Coldwave, I was like, oh man, the thing's already gone to print. If you're going to change the title, we should have had it and also the Trees on here, because they actually do fit now in the titles framework. So it's like one of those, like, if only. But then because I love them, they're a band that they've never broken up. They've stayed consistent. Every one of their records is a favorite. I'm actually there. So I mentioned traveling to see two bands. One of them was Cranes last year, and one of them this September. I'm flying out to go see, and also the Trees for the first time. I've never seen them. It's time, and I know I've spoken to Simon. America's too hard for them to come to at this point, so I'm just going to come to you. So
that will be so. I just love that new album. I thought it was just absolutely amazing. Yes, so yeah, there are just there are, because I was an indie kid, so it was like, I'd loved John Peel, so it was like the Bundy Boys, early rap, Bulgarian folk music, but there was like the Smiths and all those kind of indie bands that I adored. But then there was all these other bands like, the Comsat Angels, Sad Lovers and Giants.
Love the Comsat Angels.
There was another layer, which and the Chameleons, which was sort of up there as well. I mean, there were just so many kind of bands that really didn't fit into a scene, but they were kind of quite just serious musos, I would say, who just made some incredible music. So yes, I'm still discovering a lot of bands that I completely missed and feel quite embarrassed about.
I have a fun story. I actually played bass in the Chameleons for 2 years.
Oh man, that is amazing. Should talk.
Yeah, it was bass, by the way, which is Mark Burgess's instrument. This kind of fell into my lap in 2009. He was coming to play a tour in America, and was going to do acoustic shows. And he decided he wanted a band. He didn't want to play bass, so he picked up a band in Boston. The bass player couldn't make it. They called me up day before the show. I learned everything and played with him for 2 years on his instrument. So, but yeah, anyway, the Chameleons I've always thought were. He has a new record that is coming out, if it's not already out. After all these years, he's made some new tracks, so that's exciting.
God, that is amazing, actually.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Yes, there are just so many interesting and mysterious kind of bands. There's a couple which I can't quite remember, but they were connected to the wonderful world that is Sad Lovers and Giants. There's like a
Snake Corp.
That's the one. Yeah.
I love Snake Corp. I love them. They're like actually more like, I love the dreamy, muted, kind of underwater Sad Lovers vibes, the saxophones, But what I like about Snake Corp is they have the same guitar player, but they also don't care about just going balls to the wall, anthemic like U2 with it. And I kind of love how big how nasty that sounds sometimes, like it's like almost like the Cult mixed with Sad Lovers and Giants or something. And it kind of worked for me, even though I don't really usually go for the arena rock sounds, Yes, Snake Corp, they were so good.
Well, it's interesting because I always thought the Chameleons had a production sound which was kind of for arenas, because it was so expansive and their songs were so big, unlike a lot of the indie bands who were just kind of playing at the Arts Centre with 200 or 300 people, and when you saw them on a bigger stage it didn't work. But the Chameleons just had that kind of sound which
they should have been way bigger. They should have been way bigger because of that. They should have I think their biggest gig was opening for Simple Minds on a stadium tour, and they kind of almost stole the show, is what I've heard. Yeah, the Chameleons were like this close, man. They were this, and then I think what happened, their manager passed away, Tony Fletcher, and then there was a lot of interpersonal stuff. So yeah, so it's too bad what could have been with the Chameleons. And bands like, I think there were other ones that were close, but not as close as the Chameleons, like Comsat Angels, of course, could have been massive, I think, and tried. They certainly changed their sound to be a little more commercial over the years and didn't quite work. But, those are the bands that I think were on the precipice of something that could have been there but just didn't get there.
Yes, well, I think well, it's great that these compilations that are coming out are sort of highlighting so many, because I think it just takes somebody to hear one track and then just go down that rabbit hole and then want to listen to all of the work. And because most of it isn't, it's kind of fantastic. I mean, it's just like a band from Manchester called Easterhouse, which again, it's like, God, I missed this the first time. And
I remember them.
The quality of it is stunning. But again, after one album, there was a split and then they made a second, but it wasn't quite the same as the first one. But you had bands like the Redskins who made this one classic album, and then again, they disappeared. So yes, the 80s is a great thing to do. So look, going back to your compilation,
Sure.
Your compilations. I mean, this is coming out. Is it this month, May 2020?
It's coming out any minute if it's not already out. It's coming out on. What are we on? What is today's date? Is it the
29th? Actually,
29th. Actually, so it's out. I think it's out. Or if it comes out on the 31st, I'm not entirely positive. Maybe. I'm trying to figure.
I mean, because Cherry Red always do these beautiful box.
They do,
They also put great notes. Did you?
I'm sorry. It's out. I'll just correct myself real quick. Sorry, we can ask again. On May 31st, so it's out in 2 days.
2 days.
2 days. I thought it was really close. I mean, I know some people have been getting their copies, so it got blurry for me. Go on.
Yes, I was going to say, because I love their booklets and their information.
Yes.
Is this something that you also work on as well, or is that sort of elsewhere that those bits are put together?
So both box sets, I wrote the liner notes and the essay. There's an essay in both that what I think they both genres mean to me. So I pen them myself, and the liner notes, which for me, each one I kind of just like to give. I try to summarize an entire band's career into 100 words or less is kind of tough, but it's a nice challenge. So being able to try to do justice to everybody and kind of go through their whole career. I like to talk about their new music if they're still making music in these blurbs, because it's important to celebrate what they're still up to, but also give a snapshot of what they've done. The trickiest bit is the bands. There's a band on here called Two.
Yes.
And they released 1 7-inch, and that was all they ever did. And there's like zero information in the world, even by my standards. But I excel in finding that information out. I couldn't find nothing, couldn't find anything. But yeah, there's it's my favorite part about doing this. Really, is being able to write about bands I love, and it's as a journalist, as a blogger, as all these things over the years. It's just what I shine at,
Well, absolutely. There's nothing like going down a rabbit hole. And then do you have a sort of an idea of what you might want to do for future compilations? Is there a sort of some kind of interest or some creative project that you're thinking, God, we've got to follow this one up with another collection?
Yeah, well, so I've been talking to Richard, who works at Cherry Red, and about a couple different ideas. We've picked a couple that we're like sort of sorting out. I've wanted to do something on minimal synth, which is a very European subsect of, really rickety DIY synthesizer music. We've talked about slowcore, which is a mostly American movement of like Red House Painters and Low and bands like that are really slow and doomy, but also dreamy and beautiful. We've kicked a few cans around, so to speak, and we're trying to figure out what to do next. But it seems to be a very good, fruitful relationship, and we like working together. And we're going to hopefully keep doing some more of these down the line.
Oh, well, this is great. Well, look, this has been fantastic, Frank. Thank you ever so much for giving me the time for this. This has been fascinating. Yeah. And yes, for us kind of fans, old people, but I'm sure all the young kids are going to get very excited with these. Because there was a festival, wasn't there, recently? There was in America something Darkwave or something that was slightly gothy, which had some strange bands like Duran Duran, I think.
Oh yes, the Cold Darker Waves Festival, and then Coldwaves Festival. Both of them are in California. Yeah, they're interesting because there's a lot of new bands. So I do want to say this is there are these new bands like Boy Harsher or Twin Tribes, Boot Blacks. Like they're kind of pals of mine, and they also do this sound that's very indebted to these 80s bands. And that's also what's bringing a lot of this music back, is these new bands are getting so popular and getting blown up that it's like, so that I think these festivals are trying to put the new bands with the classic bands. And again, because genres are all muddy, and you can love Duran Duran and love Moav or love the Vileys, and you can like have space for both of them in your heart, that it makes sense that you would put them together, because Duran Duran have a couple really dark tracks. Duran Duran have a lot of the same bedrock that some of these bands have. They just go in a more pop direction.
Yes.
So there's no reason why, the chauffeur couldn't sit on a DJ set along with UV pop. I think there's certainly worlds where that works, and those festivals are cool. I haven't been to one. I'd really like to, but at this last one, they had Tones on Tail. They had the Faint, which I think are like actually a very good gateway for me in the early 2000s. They were an electronic band out of Omaha, Nebraska, who started doing synth punk in that way. So I think it's a way to combine those newer bands with the older bands and kind of cross the audiences in that sense.
Yes. Did you ever sort of, with this collection, would a band like The Sound, would that be at all into a collection like this, or would you not put them in that category?
See, like I mentioned about and also the trees, I thought when we originally started this, I was thinking Darkwave meant to me electronic but guitars, dreamy but abrasive. That like XYMOX was the archetype, right? XYMOX is the archetype of Darkwave to me as far as where it goes. Like I mentioned, Black Tape Blue Girl Project had the ethereal side. There's more EBM side. I wasn't going for more post-punk so much. Like I love the sound. I think Adrian Borland was an unsung talent. But the same reason I wouldn't have put the Chameleons on here and didn't think to put And Also the Trees until we went to put the word Coldwave on. And I was like, okay, maybe we could have been a little more expansive. Darkwave, see some of the bands that we did pick on here, like Sad Lovers and Giants and Exmo Deutschland, I thought did have a bit of indebtedness to The Cure, and that's why there was a lineage to that, I think, but I didn't want to over pick that, because then at this point, then we're looking at just a post-punk compilation, which is a lot of my favorite music, but then that's a whole nother can of worms,
No, I understand.
A delicate balance.
But it was nice, because actually I did an interview with Simon from And Also the Trees, and I think before they even had a record, they supported The Cure, didn't they? Which was a little kind of yes, I think they were about 15 or 16, which I thought, wow, that's just boggling really. But it's great. I love all these kind of connections and stories, so it does work well.
Well, and in the end, the fun thing about genres is, there's always going to be someone's like, well, why didn't you pick this band, or this isn't dark. It's like, it means whatever you want it to mean, really. And it could, like, music is just so awesome in that way. I don't want to get in the minutiae of it too much, and I'm not looking to like ever argue with anybody about anything. It's just like, this is what I think is this, and I could have easily picked another disc. You could, and the beauty of the modern era is you can make a whole nother disc.
Yes,
you just pick stuff on Spotify, burn a CD, make a digital MP3 collection, and make what you think is Darkwave, and and you're going to be right too. You're totally right.
This is true. Yes, brilliant. Well, look, I'll let you move on, but thank you ever so much. And if you want, I can always send you the link, and and put this out, because obviously it'll be great to get more publicity for the collection. Thanks again, Frank. This has been great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, and have a great day.
You too.
See you later. Bye. And that, dear listener, as you could imagine, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Frank for giving me the time for that interview, and the collection. Just to repeat myself, which you do when you get to a certain age. No Songs Tomorrow. Brilliant collection, full CD box set, and covering basically the 80s. So you can find that from all good record shops, and also probably on various other, channels. Cherry Red Records, do check them out. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show, you will be able to locate me. It's true. And all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.